include Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings. This is what I told you yesterday, that together with the book of Deuteronomy, they're actually considered Deuteronomistic history because they contain the same theme, that of the renewal of the covenant. Okay, the latter prophets is what is prophecy or prophetic books, strictly speaking. So here we get to encounter real prophecy and prophetic literature. Because in the former prophets, of course, the presence of the prophets are mentioned, but it's not the main content of the books. In the latter prophets, it's basically focused on the prophets whose name would appear in the books that we have. Okay. So when it comes to the former prophets, the book of Joshua tells us about the leadership of Joshua after taking over from Moses. So he led the people to enter the promised land and also in conquering various cities in Palestine. So he also deals with the division of the land among the tribes of Israel. That's why portions of Joshua, sometimes you'll find it boring to read because it will tell you about how they subdivided the whole Palestine into the 12 tribes of Israel. But it would be interesting to actually go through those materials. The second book in the former prophets is the book of Judges. It begins with an introduction about the entry into Canaan that is also discussed in Joshua. And I also already mentioned that the perspective is different. The one that you have in the book of Judges is a gradual and less violent entry, while in Joshua, it's a conquest. So you see, if in Genesis we have in chapter 1 and 2, you have different ways of telling the story of creation. Here, in this collection called Former Prophets, you will find that the entrance or the entry into settlement into the promised land is actually presented by two of these books, Joshua and Judges, what with different perspective. I already mentioned Joshua. It basically comes in, tells us the story about how the Israelite conquered the different tribes around it so that they'll be able to take over the place. But in the book of Judges, it talks about a gradual and less violent entry into the promised land. Now, the rest of the story in the book of Judges will recount to us in a flexible literary device persons who were considered judges at that time, like Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. So before the kings were chosen to be leaders of Israel, the judges were the first leaders. In fact, they say Saul was the first king. That's actually also basically acted as a judge first before he became king. Then we have the first book of Samuel. The book basically will talk about the establishment of the monarchy of the kingdom of Israel, the rise and fall of Israel's first king, Saul, and then the last part would bring in David and his tension with Paul. So it prepares basically for the second book of Samuel. So in the second book of Samuel, mostly devoted to the kingship of David. So if you want to know about David, King David, second book of Samuel is basically devoted to him, about his successes as a political leader, as well as basically the internal crisis. For example, the rebellion of Absalom, as well as also the weaknesses of David along with it. The next one is the first book of Kings. It begins with David's death and coronation of Solomon as king. So Solomon was considered to be a wise, wealthy, and well-established king. He established a lot of international trade. After his death, a strife occurred which divided the monarchy. So divided into the north and south. In the north, having Israel as its center or capital under King Jeroboam. And in the south, with Judah as its capital under Solomon's son Rehoboam. And then the book will end with the stories about the prophet Elijah. So that's the first book of Kings. The second book of Kings, it records Elijah's death and the succession of another prophet, Elisha. So Elisha with the northern kings like Omri and Ahab. And then he was prophesying to them. Here you find the story about the fall of the northern kingdom to Assyria in 721 BCE. Then the remainder of the books focuses on the kingdom of Judah, the turmoil that leads to the fall of Judah to Babylon in 587 or 586 BCE, and eventually the collapse of the monarchy. So if you want to know about the whole kingdom of Israel from its inception, from its beginning to its heights, and of course until its destruction, you just have to read basically the books of Samuel and Kings, because it will provide you with the story. So then, of course, after this, we mentioned that another name for the former prophets is the Deuteronomistic history. So this is something to do with the appearance of key themes from Deuteronomy. Example, law and covenant, a broad sense of retributive justice, and an increasing importance of a single sanctuary in Jerusalem. So that's what you find in this collection of materials as well. Now, the latter prophets. So when we talk about the latter prophets here, we talk about, strictly speaking, prophetic books or prophecies of those who have been called to be prophets. So, but before we go into that, I think we have to understand, at least we have to come to an agreement. We have to be on the same page with regards to who is the prophet. So the prophet that we talk about here did not predict the future, though sometimes they could do it. Their primary concern is to communicate God's message to God's people and their leaders in the present circumstances. So they are always called to task. They're called to basically announce the good news from God as well as denounce. That's basically what you have in the second part. They also challenge the established social order by reminding leaders to keep the covenant and execute justice for the people. So these are the two functions of the prophet: to announce, the first part, and then the second one is to denounce. Because you cannot announce and make and effect some changes if nothing will be denounced and eradicated from the community. So that's generally the what we call this, the role of the prophet, to be able to make sure that God's message is would get across to whom it may concern, and then of course that they also denounce the evil practices of the community. So let us be clear about it. So the role of the prophet is to announce and to denounce. That's why when we talk about our own prophetic office as Christians, is also basically that we announce the good news, but we denounce the bad news or the evil that is happening in our society and our experience. Now, when you look at the literary feature of the Old Testament prophecy, generally it is poetry. But there are also prose account, that means narrative account, and they're also very important. It's understandable why it's poetry, because in many cases, the prophets will always speak and speak out, basically what God wants him to speak out to people. So, but there are, in this collection of books, there are literary forms, diverse literary forms. Some of the examples you find here: reports, for example, then you have speeches, then prayers. So in the reports, you find vision accounts, call narratives, and historical narratives. In the speeches, you will find prophecies. So the prophets are prophesying, so they have to make those speeches. Prophecies of disaster and or salvation. They also would express oracles of woe, trial speeches, and as well as disputation speeches. Then, of course, there are also prayers, example like praise, lament, and intercession. So the prophet would also lead in praising God for whatever blessing the community receive. He will also lead in expressing some lament if some wrongs have been done, if there are evil things that have been done by the community. And of course, intercession for the needs of the community, for the needs of the individual members of the community. So generally, these are the literary features that you can find in most of the prophetic literature that we. Of course, not everything is present, but at least more or less you find that they either had reports, speeches, or prayers in their document, in the book that is basically identified with the prophets. Now, the prophets, the latter prophets, is further divided into two. We have the major prophets. The reason why they're called major prophets because they're also considered like writing prophets. But I think the bigger reason or practical reason or obvious reason for that matter is that these three books before you are the longest books with regards to prophetic books. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So these are called the major prophets. This has nothing to do with the size of the person. It has nothing to do with that they are what do you call this, more favored than the others. No, they just have something to do with the materials, with the activities that they have done, and the length of their prophesying and so on. So you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Now, regarding Isaiah, it is divided into three parts because scholars have now established that the book of Isaiah was not written all at the same time at one time. So in fact, they were able to discover that the first Isaiah, which is chapters 1 to 39, is from the 8th century BC. And the themes that you find there would be judgment, destruction, societal injustices, and corruption of worship. The second book of Isaiah, chapters 40 to 55, came from the early mid 6th century BCE. So that's mid 6th century BCE. That's almost basically the time of the exile. So here what is, or even after. And then after that, and then the themes that are discussed in this second book would be restoration, renewal, and a new exodus. Now, regarding the third Isaiah, the third book of Isaiah, which is from chapters 56 to 66, is said to be coming from the late 6th century BCE. So this is post-exilic. So contents would be salvation, hope in the midst of economic and political instability. I think it would be good to read this portion of Isaiah because it can resonate basically with our circumstances today that we are in pandemic. Hopefully we can draw some hope and encouragement from the text. So because the theme, if you look at it, is salvation, hope in the midst of economic and political instability. Of course, we have a crisis at present. So I told you the major prophets is something to do with the length of the book and of course also the duration of the prophesying. So it's up to 66 chapters, just the book of Isaiah. Now we go to the book of Jeremiah. So it is divided into three parts. The first 25 chapters would contain poetry and prophecies. Chapter 26 to 45, you will read biographical narratives about Jeremiah. And then 46 to 52, you have prophecies against other nations. So again, the book of Jeremiah is part of the major prophets because it's a very long text, 52 chapters. And then the third one is Ezekiel. So it is divided basically into 5 parts, and the middle part, basically, chapter 33, is a transition from the first part to the second part. So Ezekiel 1 to 24, the first 24 chapters, talks about visions, allegories, and symbolic acts. In chapters 25 to 32, you will find diatribes and oracles. So these are different forms of expressing some of the materials that have been announced. And then, of course, we mentioned earlier that chapter 33 is a transition from the first part to the second part. In Ezekiel 34 to 39, you will find the passages of restoration. And then Ezekiel 40 to 48, you have the vision of the New Jerusalem. So you see, it's also a very big book in the sense that it contains 48 chapters. So it's part of that collection. So you have 66, and how many we have in Jeremiah? 52, and then we have 48. And then you will see the difference because these are generally the long prophetic books that we have. They have so many chapters. Now, the second division of the latter prophets, aside from the major prophets, of course you will know, are the minor prophets. Again, the minor has nothing to do with the size. Has nothing to do, but has something to do with that they talk. They only prophesied or made a prophecy in a probably a short time, and they hardly have very long texts here. So they are actually divided according to the period when they appeared. So Amos, Hosea, and Micah were the earlier ones who appeared basically in the 8th century. Then Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk in the late 7th century. Then the book of Obadiah, that's exilic period. This is the shortest of the prophets because it doesn't even contain a second chapter. So it only contains several verses. Then Haggai and Zechariah are both post-exilic, as well as Joel, Malachi, and Jonah. So these are also called the book of the 12th. Now, the next group of books that we have is what is called the writings, the Ketuvim, because the prophets are basically referred to as, what do you call this, Nevi'im, from Nabi for prophet, Nevi'im. So the writings are subdivided into 3 groups. You have the Psalms. Obviously, they have to be separated from the rest. Then you have the wisdom literature, and then you have the historical books. That's basically what you have here. So let's go to the Psalms. There are 3 major types of Psalms. One is hymns of praise. You have an example there, Psalms 29, 100, 146, 150. And then there are also laments, like Psalms 5, 13, 22, and 88. Lamentation basically is a very sad expression when someone is what do you call this, remorseful or asking for mercy and is crying because he has done something wrong. Those are part of what laments would be. And then the third part would be thanksgiving psalms. You have Psalm 30 there, 34, 107, 116. So of course there's still a lot in the list that we have. But more or less, these are the general categories of psalms. So hymns of praise, laments, thanksgiving psalms. So does anyone know how many psalms do we have in our collection, in our Bible? Do you know? How many? What was that again? 150. So if you bring along with you your Bible, you would be able to actually peruse that. So we only have 150 at least in the list. Now, not all of them would fit this what do you call these categories. So that's why there are other psalms that are more or less identified according to their own according to the content of the psalms. For example, here you have the Psalms of Trust. You have Psalm 23 and 121. Psalm 23 is we call this the Good Shepherd. Is has something to do with that one. Then creation psalms in Psalm 8, and then enthronement psalms like Psalm 95 to 99. You're familiar probably with Psalm 95 because that's usually what we use in the invitatory psalm. Then you have the royal psalms in Psalm 2. Then hymns of Zion, Psalm 84 example. And then you have the Torah Psalms in 119. And then you have wisdom Psalms, like Psalm 1. And then storytelling Psalms in Psalms 105, 106, and so on. Do you know what is the longest Psalms? The longest Psalm?
122, Father. Psalm 122.
Are you sure? How many verses?
I mean, sorry, Father. The longest verse pala of the Psalm is Psalm 22. Found
Okay.
in something.
What is the Psalm? What is the Psalm that has
125.
sorry?
125.
Psalm 125? I don't think so.
Yes.
Tingnan niyo pa, you can use it and look at it.
Father, 119.
119. That's 119. How many verses?
I think that
You can locate that in those of you, those who have
I think 160, 76,
76,
70,
200,
176.
176. So that's the longest, 119. What's the shortest? Psalm.
117, Father.
117. How many verses?
There are only 2 verses, Father.
Okay, only 2 verses. So those are trivia that you could actually try to remember, because at least it's sometimes when you create some quizzes for students or something like that, you can actually remember those. Before I've encountered a message in Facebook, sometimes sent through email. There was somebody who tried to, I don't know, I haven't done it yet, that if you count the number of chapters in the, I think chapters, it was chapters that he counted in the whole Bible, and then divided into 2, you'll be able to more or less locate the place of the what is in the middle of the Bible. And that place basically they found or would be in Psalm 118 verse 8. And it's in between the longest and the shortest psalm in the collection. So what is written in Psalm 118 verse 8? It would be interesting to find out what is written there. And they say that that's what is in the middle of the Bible. Can you check your Bible?
What Psalm, Father?
118 verse 8.
Verse 8.
Yes.
8.
Basa.
Better to take refuge in the Lord than put one's trust in mortals.
Okay. So better put your trust in the Lord than on men, than on human beings. Which is actually a very, very correct way of looking at things. So because ultimately, what the Bible is asking us to do is to just trust God and follow what He commands. So it's basically what they say, what is at the middle of the whole Bible. So trust God, not men. It is better to trust God than human beings. So anyway, those are just trivia, but if you have time, of course, we know a lot of Psalms to the breviary, but it will be good to also find out that some of the Psalms that are not included in what you usually pray in the office or in the morning prayer, evening prayer, night prayer, and so on. Okay, that's about the Psalms. Now let's go to the wisdom literature. The wisdom literature, of course, in the context of, by the way, in your course in theology, if you are doing the 4-year course, you will have a special course on prophets and wisdom and prophets. So you'll be able to study many of these books more or less in depth. So you'll be able to study that as well. So here in the wisdom literature, We have Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, the book of Job, the book of Ecclesiastes, or of course sometimes called Kohelet, and then the book of Sirach and the book of. Okay, can you put off your microphone because we could hear karaoke? Anyway, the last one there is called the Scrolls or the Megilloth. But these are here you will find several books under this category. So so what is under the Scrolls or the Megilloth are some of the other books that you know about. We have the book of Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. And of course, these different scrolls, they are called five scrolls, and they are singled out as they are basically put together as one under the title Five Scrolls or the Megilloth, because they are in this book basically they are associated with Jewish festivals. So here in the chart that you see on the right column, you will be able to find the ancient Israelite festival that is indicated in this different. If you read the book of Ruth, you'll find the festival of weeks, Shavuot, or that's basically what they refer to as the Pentecost, because it is the festival of weeks is 50 days after the after the Passover, the first Passover. Then the Song of Songs talks about the Passover or the Pesach. Then you have the Ecclesiastes who talk about the festival of tabernacles, that's Sukkot. And then Lamentations, the book of Lamentations is will deal with the also with of course by the name itself it's already an indication that it is rather sad text because it's lamenting the destruction of the temple. It is celebrated on the 9th of because that's the date of the destruction of the temple. And then lastly, you have the book of Esther. If you read the book of Esther, normally if we are together, and we could probably, I usually have my students watch the movie. Maybe you can look it in YouTube. Maybe you can locate it in YouTube. The movie One Night with a King. One Night with a King. So One Night with a King. The story of Esther. So if you watch that movie, you'll be able to appreciate reading the book of Esther. So in this particular book, what is the festival that is associated with it is the Feast of Purim. This is basically just a celebration of their what do you call this delivery from annihilation. Because in the story, if you read the story or watch the movie, there was somebody who was an enemy to Judaism who wanted to take advantage of his position in the what do you call this in the kingdom of Babylon, and he wanted to eradicate all the Jews out of his land. But you'll be able to see it. So that's why they celebrate Purim, because through the help of Esther Hasada, they were able to be saved from being annihilated. So these are generally books that are associated with the festival. That's ice cream. I can feel it, hear the ice cream. Kaninong sound yan? Where's it coming from? So, can you put off your microphone, whoever that is, so we could hear the noise from the streets? Okay, let me continue. So the third group. So we have Psalms, then we have basically wisdom, and then the last group of books are under the title historical books. Of course, when you say historical, it talks about some events that had happened in the experience of the community, but let's not consider them as strictly speaking history, because I don't think when they were writing about it, their intention was not to come up with a historical account of what happened, but again, even if it talks about the incidents that had happened in the community, but it talks about something that had happened in history, but their intention was not so much the event that had happened, but what God has basically done to them or helped them in the process to be able to get out of a crisis or what help they have received from Him and so on. So here in this collection, we find the books 1 and 2 Chronicles. Here in 1 and 2 Chronicles, you can find identical stories that are found in the book of Kings and Samuel. So it's actually, you will find there stories about King David. But of course, the perspective on King David is much more favorable to King David. So in Chronicles, you will find King David as someone who is only a good king and so on. And like, for example, in the book of Kings, the second book of Kings, it will show you basically the good side and even also the bad side of King David. So it's a very, the one in second book of Kings is much more balanced in a sense, because it gives you a very good picture of a king who is both good and also has his own weaknesses, who triumphs when he allows God to, when he follows God's will, and who falters and fall when he follows his own desires and so on. Because you remember what happened to him with Bathsheba, for example. So anyway, that's Chronicles. Then Ezra and Nehemiah. These are also considered prophets, but they came basically as a product of a post-exilic period. In fact, in these two books, you will find the story of that transition from Babylon, from their captivity, to go back to Judea, where they will start anew the community and restore the temple and so on. So you will find all the details in Ezra and Nehemiah. Then the next generations after that, when they are already restored themselves in Judea, the problem didn't stop. So after the Babylonians or the Persians, after the Persians, what came were the Greeks. So when they were overpowered by the Greeks, under the leadership of King of we call this Alexander the Great. If you have seen that movie again, it will basically tell you about the conquest of Alexander. So he was able to reach basically Palestine. The problems in that is mentioned by the book of Maccabees did not happen during the time of Alexander. It happened afterwards when some Greek leaders were basically appointed to become leaders in the place. It was their abuses that the community was hurting against. So they fought against it. So that's why one famous personality in the story is Judas Maccabeus, because he was the one who led the Jews in fighting against those who desecrated the temple, mainly the Greeks who were leading the community at the time. So that's generally what you have in the collection of historical books. So this is the third part of the third part. So because the third part is generally called writings, and of course the third part has something to do with historical books. Now there are additional writings, the book of Daniel, Tobit and Judith, Baruch, and in the Eastern Orthodox they have additional collections like 1 and 2 Esdras, which is similar to what you find in the book of Ezra, and then the prayer of Manasseh, and then Psalm 151. You remember our Psalms in the Bible is only 150. So the Orthodox, they have an additional 151st Psalm. They also have a third book of Maccabees. We only have 1 and 2 Maccabees. And of course, we also know that there is also a fourth book of Maccabees available in the internet. But the one that is included in our canon are only 2. But it's also good to know that the other books, like the third Maccabees, is present in the collection of Eastern Orthodox churches. So, but if when you're studying the Bible, you can no longer just say that I'm only going to study what is in my canon, because you will lose basically the richness of this collection that can basically help you maybe widen your horizon in terms of the study of these different things here and there. So this is basically what is the content of the Old Testament. As I mentioned, the whole of the Old Testament is divided into 3 parts. You have the Torah or the Pentateuch. Then you have the prophets, the Nevi'im, and you have the writings or the Ketuvim. So we mentioned that in the Pentateuch we have the first 5 books from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And then in the prophets, they are divided into first the former and the latter prophets. And then the latter prophets is divided into 2, the major and the minor. And then, of course, you know the contents of both of this one. And then the last group, last category, which is basically called writings, are subdivided into 3. So you have the Psalms, the wisdom, books of wisdom. Then, of course, you have the historical writings. So more or less, these are the books that are contained in our text. So this is basically from the article written by David A. Leiter in that collection of articles that are put together in a book, Ecumenical Study of the Scripture, whose editor is Michael Gorman. So any questions regarding this one? So I cannot go into the details much of the books that we have here because it will really take some time. I just gave you basically an overview of the contents and how more or less you can group them together. So these are generally what has been suggested, at least the best suggestion so far, regarding how to group together these different books that are in the Old Testament, or at least in our Old Testament. Any question?
Question, Father.
Okay.
How many authors wrote the book of Psalms, Father?
Of course, the manuscripts and the text doesn't contain any name of any author. But many of the Psalms that you are there are actually attributed to David, King David. But it doesn't show basically his name in the writings. But like any other book, especially in the Old Testament, it's so hard to identify the actual identity of the authors. That's why we mentioned at the beginning that most of these books that you find in the Old Testament generally are anonymous. It's so difficult to discover or identify the real author behind them. Even the prophetic books, even if they are named after them, you're not even sure whether the prophets would know how to write. So you cannot just assume that they will be the ones who wrote them. Maybe someone else wrote it for them, who were basically maybe watching and monitoring their activities and the like. But it's not always as an assurance that just because a particular book is identified with a certain name, that is already basically the actual author behind it. So because of the limited materials or resources that we have, and previously in the ancient times when they were writing things, they were not putting the name of the authors in their articles and so on. So it would really be difficult to identify them. Okay, so when you study the book of Psalms, you just have to study each of the Psalms and maybe talk about the possible author by means of reconstructing the characteristic, the possible profile of the author. But as to the identity, I don't think it would be easy to actually do that. Okay, so at least majority of it is identified with King David. Whether he wrote them or someone else did for him is another thing. Anyway, in ancient times, when you talk about authorship, it doesn't always mean that the author is the one who wrote it. Because in the olden times, and even recently, people could actually pay someone to write for them. And if you pay someone to write for you, that person who wrote it is not actually recognized as the author, but the one who actually paid someone to write for him. In the same way that, for example, famous people like kings or presidents or archbishops and bishops, sometimes they have writers of their speeches or their homilies. But even if the priest who write the homily of the archbishop will not be mentioned in the homily, that homily will be identified with the one who actually delivered it, like the bishop or the archbishop and so on. So that understanding authorship that way is another level, another layer that we have to consider in identifying the many leaders that we have here in this particular experience.